welcome everybody to the Sunday morning service. If you would please stand and turn your hymnals to page 167. We'll sing the first and last verse, page 167.
See everybody in the house of the Lord this morning. I want to welcome everybody into the Sunday school hour. If we have any visitors, we want to make you feel welcome. It's been a beautiful week. The Lord's blessed us with some beautiful weather, and looks like we're going to have some nice weather this week. I think we're going to get a little bit of rain, and it's supposed to be a nice day outside today, but this is the Lord's day. We can rejoice and be glad in it. I'm glad we're in the house of God today. I know we've got some that's going on vacation this week, Thanksgiving week, and that's something I'll be talking about in just a few minutes. But if anybody's had any birthdays or wedding anniversaries, will you come forward and put your money in? Nobody's getting older or been married long or don't want to talk about it today, so we won't. All right, Psalm chapter 100 is where I want to go to this morning. Amen, Brother Scott. Amen. It's a blessing to see people that you knew in school and see how God's changed their life. Brother Scott, I remember him in school, and Lord, if Brother Scott can testify to it, the Lord changed his life. That's for sure. So I appreciate the Lord being so good to us. Psalm chapter 100, a psalm of praise, the only psalm of all the psalms that it talks about being a song of prayer, a psalm of praise. It's entitled this. But in these verses, there's a strong invitation or a command to worship God. The first four verses, it says, "Make a joyful noise unto the Lord, all ye lands. Serve the Lord with gladness. Come before his presence with singing. Know ye that the Lord, he is God. It is he that hath made us, and not we ourselves. We are his people, and the sheep of his pasture. Enter into his gates with thanksgiving, and into his courts with praise. Be thankful unto him, and bless his name. For the Lord is good, his mercy is everlasting, and his truth endureth to all generations." It says to make a joyful noise. Serve the Lord with gladness. Know ye that the Lord, he is God, and then enter into his gates with thanksgiving, and his courts with praise. And it is, I think it's the will of the Lord for us to worship and praise and adore him today. This is Thanksgiving week. A day that's been set aside that every year, the Thursday, I think the last Thursday of November every year, it's a national holiday. But I think each and every day ought to be a day of thanksgiving unto the Lord for all that he's done for us. His mercy has endured to us. He's been good to us. His grace, his mercy, and his love. So he gives us each and every day. But it says to come into his presence and serve him. But encouragement's given here for us to worship him. But then we get on down. It ought to be an honor for us today to come into his house with thanksgiving and praise to his name today. Enter into his gates with thanksgiving. What is Thanksgiving? I know it's a day, like I said, a national holiday, but it's a day that a lot of families get together and cook and and we all probably eat too much for Thanksgiving. But another thing that I see, it's got to where people don't, it's just another day to a lot of people. A lot of people will get together and not only eat, but they're all excited, not so much about Thanksgiving Day, but about Black Friday. What are we going to, they get their newspapers and they get every paper they can find, get all the coupons, see what's on sale. Maybe not this year so much because of the COVID and all that's going on. But in years past, people's all excited to get to Walmart and get all these places to get these sale items, get everything that they can. Fights break out. People get mad at each other, shouting matches, because they didn't grab this first, And it seems like that's just, Thanksgiving sometimes gets pushed to the side. I know Tina won't listen to Christmas music till after Thanksgiving. That's the way she's always been. We celebrate Thanksgiving, and I'm glad we do. But the Thanksgiving is an act of giving thanks, grateful acknowledgement of benefits or favors of God, giving of thanks for everything. But we're to give, for us to give Him thanks is to mean that we're in the right relationship with Him there. But here, as we get on down, some of our presidents have Abraham Lincoln, George Washington made it a point of celebrating Thanksgiving. They had some things to say about that. Psalm chapter 95 and verse 2 says, "Let us come before His presence with thanksgiving." Everything that we have comes from Him. Nothing that we can do. Everything that, the roof that's over our head, the food that we have to eat, the car we drive, the job we have, everything that we have comes from Him. But we see Thanksgiving, just like I say, every day, but especially this Thursday, should remind us of what we have and the blessings that we received from the Lord. We can see that it's not, like I said, it's not celebrated like it ought to be. But a little history of Thanksgiving Day. It was started by the Pilgrims back in the early 1620s, and it was their traditional harvest meal. They celebrated giving thanks and sacrifice for the blessings that they had, the harvest of that year. But then in 1789, President George Washington declared a national day of thanksgiving for the people of the United States. He proclaimed it as a day of public thanksgiving and thanks to God for His protection as a source of all that is good. And another thing, here's a quote from George Washington. He says, "Now therefore I do recommend and assign Thursday, the 26th day of November," which was back in that day, "to be devoted by the people of these states to the service of that great and glorious being, who is the beneficent author of all that is good, that was, that is, and that will be, that we may then all unite in rendering unto Him our sincere and humble thanks for His care and protection of the people of this country." George Washington, I think, was a good man, was a Christian man, but we see that what he has done for us. He's made us, He maintains us, and gives us all things to enjoy. We ought to enjoy the things that the Lord gives to us each and every day. We sure don't deserve what He's done for us, that's for sure. But we need to give Him all the praise and honor and glory during this Thanksgiving time. Not only just Thursday, but each and every day that we live. Let's all stand, please. We'll be dismissed to our class. May I ask Brother Rick Smith if he'll lead us in prayer, please. Amen.
Good morning. It's good to see everyone in the house of the Lord this morning in our Sunday school class. We welcome each one of you. We're still continuing our study in the book of Job. This morning we're looking at Job 38 through chapter 41. So we got 4 chapters we're looking at this morning. We won't have time in our time frame this morning to cover these 4 chapters, but we will just briefly mention the high points in each one of them if we can this morning. So if we look into chapter 38, and the close, excuse me just a moment, let's back up just a moment. As Elihu closed out his discourse in chapter 37, we see that God was stirring up a storm, a whirlwind, as it's mentioned in chapter 38, and a big storm was coming in, and Elihu was finishing up his discourse here with Job. You know, he'd been this young man. I think he spoke for about 4 or 5 chapters here, and from what some of the commentators seem to think, and if you read it and study it alone, he had about the best idea of what the problem was. These other men just kept saying, Job, you sinned, you sinned, you sinned. But Elihu had kindly, even though he was a young man, he had stood back and listened to them for several chapters, several hours or days, however long these other 3 men spoke. And he seemed to have a better grasp of exactly what was going on. So as we look into this, as he closed it out, as I said, he closed out chapter 37, Elihu made 5 observations, you might say, concerning what God consisted of, what God was, God's mightiness, God's power, his sovereignty. And these 5 observations that Elihu made, he said, we cannot find God out. He is beyond man's ability or man's capability to understand. We have such a finite mind, such a small grasp of the universe, and we're going to see that as we go through the rest of these chapters here today, that we don't really understand many, many things that God does or many things that God says, because at the moment we just look at a very, very small portion of time. Now we've got some men, I believe Brother Fitchy, you're up in about to the 90s, but if you think of that, that's not really a long time compared to eternity. So you have just seen, even though you're 90, maybe 91, 92, you've seen a lot of things happen, but still you've only seen a very, very small segment of time. So really, God is beyond our capability to understand. And many times we just see, if we have an affliction, right at that moment, we just see that little portion of time. But we don't see the big picture. God, from the time of, even before the creation of the earth, until when the rapture takes place and all is settled up and everything takes place there at the end, is a vast amount of time that really the human mind can't comprehend all of that. So he's above our ability to understand. Second of all, one of Elihu's observations is God is omnipotent, or he is all-powerful. God, and we're going to see that in these next 4 chapters, he's in control of everything. He's in control of the animal kingdom, the weather, the winds, the rotation of the earth, the placement of all the stars and everything. So God is in control of everything. Third thing he observed here, and you can read this in these last 4 verses of chapter 37, he is excellent in his judgment or justice. You know, many, many times something happens to one of us, and we say, and this is kind of the gist of all the way through the book of Job, why does bad things happen to good people? We don't comprehend that. You're going down the road and you have a blowout on your tire, on your car. You don't comprehend. Well, I checked all those tires. They look good, but you get that tire fixed and get on down to the intersection, you see a 6-car pileup, that might be why you had to blow up back down the road. But you don't know that, but God does. So he is excellent in his judgment and justice. And then he is excellent in his righteousness. God's righteousness is above human comprehension. You and I can't comprehend that. The scripture tells us, I believe there in the book of Isaiah, that our righteousness is just like filthy rags, which was the old bandages that they would take off of the leprosy sores and such. But God is excellent in his judgment or righteousness. And then the 5th observation he made there in chapter 37 at the end, he will not afflict or oppress. Therefore, men should reverence God. God does not allow these things to happen to Job. He's not punishing Job here. Job is in a trial like gold being refined in the refiner's fire. And the higher they turn up the heat and the more they stir the gold and the gold ore, the more the impurities boils off the top and the finer the gold becomes as it gets to the end. You can keep turning the heat up and I understand you can almost get gold down to almost pure, like 99.9% pure. Well, see, Job here, he's pretty much in the fire, and he's being tried, and the fire's being turned up as this goes along. First of all, he just lost his camels and his money and his farm and his donkeys and camels and his asses and such as that. Well, that's a terrible thing right there, but that wasn't the worst that was going to happen to him. Then he lost all of his children, and that wind blew the post out from under the house, and the house fell down and killed his children. That'd be a terrible, terrible thing. And then the third thing here, Satan was allowed to cover his body from head to toe with boils, sores. Just one little sore or nick on your body, it hurts. You feel it. You know it every day. But you think if your body was covered from the top of your head to the sole of your feet with those boils. And finally, I believe one of the men mentioned in the last couple of weeks, finally, he just took that old potsherd and just started scraping those sores, just trying to get that corruption and such out of his body because he was in such great pain. And so, Job, in I wrote it down. In this chapter 33, verse 1 through 12, we won't read that, but I'll just mention what it says. Job had almost accused God of being unjust. He had made some insinuations. You can say something in an insinuating manner, and you're really not saying that, but that's what you mean. So if you read verse 9 through 12, especially there in chapter 33, he had accused God of being unjust because he said, I served you, God. As his book starts out, he said he was a righteous man. He was a upright and righteous man back in chapter 1. Again, I'm going way back. But there was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job. That man was perfect and upright and one that feared God and eschewed evil. So Job had tried to be a godly man. And yet here all these terrible trials had befallen him. All this had come upon him. And he couldn't understand why this was happening. So he had almost come to the point that he was accusing God of being unjust to him. I try to do right, and yet look what has befallen upon me. And if we're not very, very careful in this life, we'll get to that point sometime ourselves. We get sick. We have a problem. We have something in our family that happens. Something terrible, tragic might happen. Someone might lose their life in a car accident or something like that. And we can't understand. We can't grasp that. But God, as I said when I started, God sees the whole picture. You and I just see a small segment of time. So we have to be very, very careful as we go through this life to realize that God is in control of this great universe. And like I said, in these next 4 chapters, we're going to see this as we look at it. So as we look into chapter 38 here, let me just read a couple verses to get started with. Then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind and said, Who is this that darkeneth counsel by words without knowledge? Gird up now thy loins like a man, for I will demand of thee, and answer me. Where wast thou when I laid the foundations of the earth? Declare if thou hast understanding. Who hath laid up the measures thereof, if thou knowest, or who hath stretched a line upon? Whereupon are the foundations thereof fastened? Or who laid the cornerstone thereof? When the morning stars shouted for and sang together, all the sons of God shouted for joy. Or who shut up the sea with doors when it brake forth, as it had issued out of the womb? When I made the cloud the garment thereof, thick darkness and a swaddling band for it, and break up for my decree place, and set the bars and the doors. So you see, God here, as he starts out speaking to Job, in these next 4 chapters, God asked Job 39 questions about the creation of the earth. We won't have time to read all these chapters, but like I said, I'll just briefly tell you what goes on here. The questions are the creation of the earth in chapter 4 through verse number 7. And then the setting of the bounds of the seas or the ocean. And you've been down to the ocean. I'm sure everybody's been down to the ocean and saw when the waves come up, if you just stand there and look at them, you see that vast ocean out in front of you. And you see those waves, and they run up on that sand, and they get to a certain point. Then they stop. Who stops those waves right there every time they come up all the way around this earth? God is in control of this universe. God's in control of those waters. And then when the dawn comes up, you'll be standing out, especially a lot of you men, if you go deer hunting or duck hunting or out in the woods or such, in the morning you'll be sitting there and it'll just be dark, and then just the sunlight and the light just comes out. You see it come out. Who controls that? God is in control of that light. God makes that light come up every morning. And then in verse 22 through verse 30, the weather conditions. If you look at this and read all this, the weather conditions. He said, let me read just verse 20. Thou shalt take the bounds thereof. Thou shalt know the paths to the house thereof. Have you entered into the treasure of the snow? Or hast thou seen the treasure of the hail? You know, a snow falling down is beautiful. A snow falling down, and you see those pretty snowflakes just dripping down. And that is a beautiful thing. But man can't control that. Man has no control over that whatsoever. Even the weather forecasters, whenever they're giving out, a storm's going to come. We're going to get 4 to 6 inches of snow. Sometimes you'll get a foot. Sometimes it won't even snow. So they don't even know. And they're studied, learned meteorologists. They're supposed to know what's going on. But they have no control over it. They don't know if it's going to snow or not. They tell you the conditions are right for it to snow. It could possibly snow, but they don't know that. And the same thing in the summertime. You'll be outside and there'll just be a little gentle shower going on. Before you know it, everything just turns black and dark. And then you'll see hailstones start falling. They come down out of the sky. We have no control over that. Sometimes they damage people's houses. Sometimes it damages people's cars. But that hail comes down at God's command. It comes down for a reason. God controls that. And then the stars, on over in verses 31 through verse 38, he mentions the stars or the constellations up in the sky. You know, you go out at night, and if you could sit out there every night or lay out there on some type of mat or a cot or something, you could never even count all those stars up there. Because stars are going and coming. They're coming all the time. And those stars, they're hanging up there. You know, if you put, like Eddie mentioned a while ago about the seasons and such, on down toward Christmas, people goes out and they hang little ornaments on their Christmas tree. But each one of them, you got a little hanger and you hang it up on a limb. What's holding those stars up in the sky? Only God could do that. Only God could speak that into existence. And he mentions here about these 4 constellations. He said, let me read the verses. Verse 31 says, can thou bound us the sweet influence of Pleiades, or loose the bands of Orion? Can thou bring forth Mazzaroth in season, or can thou guide Arcturus and his sons? Man has no control over these stars. Back in the 60s, back when we were still in high school and such, they went to the moon, and they put rockets and a space program going on. And it was a great accomplishment that they did fly to the moon and back. But that's just a tiny, tiny little speck in comparison to God speaking this world into existence. We can't even go to the next closest planet, which I believe they say is maybe Mars. They've been planning that since back in the 60s and talking about that and sits and all about that. But they've never even made an attempt to go to Mars. Man has no control whatsoever over this great universe. And then it goes on down in verse 39 and verse 40, he mentions the lion. Will thou hunt the prey for the lion, or fill the appetite of the young lions, when they crouch in their dens and abide in the covert to lie in wait? The animal kingdom, God is in control of the animal kingdom. There's nothing that you and I can do. Even the best hunter in this group, he goes out in the morning and climbs up in a tree stand. A deer might come by, and a deer might not come by. You have no control over that. Any of you men that's ever spent any time hunting out in the woods, you can't make a deer come down the trail where you're hunting. You can go out there and pretty much plan and do your best, but God controls the animal kingdom. On down in verse 41, he mentions, who provideth for the raven his food when his young ones cry out unto God? They wander for lack of meat. The ravens, and this in that day, the ravens, the blackbird, the crow, we have no, again, man can't control that. Any of you men who's ever done any farming, I know Brother Gene probably, you plant your field of corn, and it starts picking up just a couple inches above the ground, and here comes the crows, and they dig all that up, and eat your seed corn right off the end, and just ruin your crop. You have no control over that. You may stay out there and shoot a couple of them or put up a scarecrow and such, but you don't have any control over those ravens or crows. They come and they eat whenever they get ready because God provides for them. So as we look at this, God is in control of this great universe, this great animal kingdom, these stars, this planet. He mentioned, I got a little bit ahead of myself. Back in verse 6, he said, whereupon are the foundations hang thereof? What holds this earth up where it's at? If you build a house, you have to go out and you have to build a foundation and square everything up and get everything built, and you have to have something to put it on. But if you've seen pictures of planets and such, they just sit out there in space. And God put each one of them in its proper orbit so they don't bump into each other, so they don't get, this earth that we live on, it don't get too close or too far away from the sun, whether we'd be scorched and burned up or get too far back, we'd freeze to death. So God is in control of this great universe. So he asked Job these 39 questions. I know we kind of rushed through that chapter, but he asked Job through these 39 chapters, where were you? How did you do this? What holds this? Who controls the animal kingdom? And all but before this, Job can't answer any of these questions. Job has no answer whatsoever for these questions that God has asked him in this chapter 38. So God's point, or God's reasoning for asking Job these questions, Job must realize that God is sovereign and omnipotent and the creator who answers to no one. Job didn't have to answer to anyone. God didn't have to answer to anyone, excuse me. God is in control of this great universe. So then he tells Job there, and he tells him now, gird up your loins like a man. Get ready. You're going to have to come up with some answers, Job. I'm asking you these questions, and I expect some answers from you. You've made this request. You've asked to talk to me. You've asked to come before me and bring your case, and yet here I am answering these questions, and you don't have any answers for me whatsoever. You can't answer even these basic creation questions that I'm asking you here. So he's asking Job what to answer the questions that he's asking him, and Job has no answer whatsoever for God. So the answer would be that the answer to God's questions is that God is the great creator and the architect of this universe. And Job had no control, no thought. Job wasn't even born when God thought of creating this universe. There wasn't even a man on earth at that time till God created Adam. So Job has no thought, no recourse, no way that he would even have the way of gaining this information that God's questioning him here, because he wasn't even born. All right, if we look on now into chapter 39, we're going to see some questions here. In verse 39, the first question that God mentions is these wild goats that roamed in that area. The wild goats of the rock bring forth their young, and you cannot mark when they... Can you mark the number of the months when they fulfill, or knowest the time when they bring forth? Job, do you know when these animals out here are going to bring forth their young? Do you provide food for them? Do you have anything whatsoever that you can control these wild animals anyway? Canst thou number the months? Look at verse number 3 in chapter 39. They bow themselves. They bring forth their young ones. They cast out their sorrows. The young ones are in good liking. They grow up with corn. They go forth, and they return not. God feeds these wild goats he's mentioning here. God is in control of the time of the birth. And you know yourselves, again, in the animal kingdom, God is in control of all this. You and I have now I know people today, they have herds of cattle and horses and such, and they have these things mated together, and they count the days, and this horse should come in a certain day, or this cow should calve on a certain day, but you don't have any control of that. It may go 4 or 5 days past, it may be born early, just like in the birth of a child. You go to the doctor, and the doctor says, oh yes, you're going to have a baby on June the 14th. That baby might not be born on June the 14th. It may come in the first part of June, it may come on over in July. God is in control of everything in nature. Man has no control over this whatsoever. And then he looks on down to verse number 5, and he mentions the wild ass out in the forest and out in the nature, out in the desert areas there. These animals, they were not able to be domesticated. They were a free-ranging animal, just like most of these wild horses in the western part of the United States. Sometimes they go out there and they round up and they catch some of them, but these animals are really hard to do anything with. And this wild ass that he's mentioning here, it's free. It runs wild. It can't be contained. You can't contain it. You can't ever catch or make it to be a plow horse or a riding animal because they're so hard to contain or to tame down. You can't tame them down, but God feeds them every day. God has the grass, and he has waters and streams and water holes, and they know where all these areas are because God is directing them through their mind. Then you look on down to verse number 9. Will the unicorn be willing to serve thee or abide by your crib? Now the unicorn here, many of the commentators mentioned here, it does not mean, you know, you see a picture of a big white horse with a horn on the front of its head, but it does not necessarily mean that that's what it's talking about here. That is a fictitious creature. But according to this, it's a wild bull that was, or a wild oxen that was in that area at that time, which is long extinct now. And they had real big long horns like the Texas Longhorns do now. But they were massive and they were big, and they had such a size to them that they just could not be controlled. The animal was very strong and powerful. Even some of the scholars seem to think it might have been referring here to the rhinoceros with that horn on the front of its head. So that animal could not be tamed, as he says here. Wilt thou believe him and bring him home and use him to plow, or to use him in your barn to band in the furrow, or will he harrow the valleys for you? This animal could not be tamed. It could not be used as a domesticated animal. Now, they used oxen in those days, but they were a different breed of animal. It was not this animal here that he's talking about in this verse. And then in verse number 13, he mentions the peacocks and the ostrich. Again, these animals. And he mentions the peacock and the ostrich here because of the beautiful plumage that's on those animals. I know if you've ever dealt with or saw a peacock, those male peacocks, whenever they stand out there and they fan that tail out, and those little dots all over those feathers, every one of them just look like an eye looking at you almost. You see those, they're beautiful, they're pretty. And then he flips right over and mentions the ostrich here. The ostrich has beautiful plumage. The feathers of an ostrich all the way down in the 20s and 30s, women used to use ostrich feathers in their hat. They were real pretty. They were beautiful animals. The feathers were beautiful, but you can't control those ostriches. They're a wild animal. Sure, you see them in a circus or in a zoo sometimes, but they're not a domesticated type animal. And also it mentions on down in verse number 17, but God hath deprived her of wisdom. Speaking of the ostrich, they say these ostriches will just lay their eggs. They'll lay up to 100 eggs in a nest. And sometimes they'll just go off and leave them. They lay them in the sand in these warm countries, in the climates and such. And the sun and the warmth of that sand causes those eggs to hatch out. Now they say that the mother ostrich comes back at night, but in the daytime she'll wander far, far away from them. She's not like a bluebird or a hummingbird or something that builds a nest and stays right there and sits on the nest and takes care of the young and feeds them and such. The ostrich likes to wander around. And well, he says, and he deprived her of wisdom and imparted knowledge to her. And she lifteth her head up high, and she scorneth the horse and his rider. This ostrich is a very, very fast animal. You've seen those. And they say, I don't know anything about an ostrich but such, but they say they can outrun a horse, even with a rider on them. They're so fast. But they have some traits that make them lack wisdom. I guess I'll just say that. I won't say that they're dumb, but they lack wisdom. Because they say the ostrich will run in a circle. It runs in a circle whenever it's running. So whenever something wants to catch an ostrich, or whenever they want to catch an ostrich, one person would chase the ostrich on a horse, and somebody else could just lie and wait for it out there and lasso it when it comes by, because they lack knowledge, they lack wisdom. But God has made them this way. You and I don't know the answer to that. We don't know why it happens that way, but that is the way that God has made them. And then we look on down in verse 19 of chapter 39. Hast thou given the horse strength? Hast thou closed his neck with thunder? He's mentioning the horse here. The horse is a magnificent animal. And people who deal with horses, they know this. They are beautiful. He has a leaping ability like the grasshopper. This is speaking here of a war horse in that day. And you know, they say in that day that some of these horses were trained so well, and they had a natural, or a lack of a natural fear for the battle. They would just charge right into these battles. You know, you've seen some of these older movies and such back in the older days, whenever they would have these battles, and these horses just charge into these battles. They're snorting, their mane is flowing, their tails are flipping up and down in the air. They just go in. He says, verse 22 of 39, chapter 39 says, he mocketh fear, he is not afraid, neither turneth back from the sword. He'll just charge right into the battle. Some of these horses got to the point that seemingly you don't know the mind of the horse. God does, but you and I don't. Seemed like they enjoyed the battle. Seemed like they loved serving their master. They loved this. So they loved this ability here. They were fearless, and they were not afraid. Job couldn't make this animal that way. Only God could make such a beautiful animal as a horse. And you know yourself that some of these horses, you see these Palominos, you see these Appaloosas, and a beautiful horse that's curried down real pretty and smooth and got its mane laying over to the right or left side one. They're a beautiful animal. But man had no control or no input whatsoever into this beautiful animal. Only God could make this horse. And then the last creature he sees down at the end of the chapter 39, he mentions, doth the hawk fly by thy wisdom? He asked Job, does the hawk fly by your wisdom, Job? And stretch her wings toward the south? Doth the eagle mount up at thy command and make her nest on high? Job, do you have any control over the hawk? You have any control over the eagle? And Brother Eddie and myself and anybody else, if you fool with any kind of poultry, you know that. The hawk comes and gets what he wants when he wants to come get it. You have hardly no control over that whatsoever. And then here he's mentioning the eagle. The eagle makes its nest on high up in the rocky crags and high up on the cliffs and such, where he can sit up there and watch for his prey. And whenever he sees a rabbit or a squirrel or some kind of a bird or some kind of animal he might want, he just swoops down off that perch, and with those talons he picks it up and he's gone. Do we have any control of that? No, we have no way we can touch that. No way you can control that. But God controls these animals. And then it said in verse 29 of chapter 39, it says, from thence she seeketh her prey, and her eyes behold afar off. You've heard, you got an eagle eye. That eagle can sit up there and see a great distance all the way around those plains and all the way around in those wooded areas and such. And it'll see something that you and I can't even see. It's created by God. And then verse 40, we'll look at verse number 40. I'm kind of getting in a hurry and running out of time too. But in verse number 40, moreover, Job answered God and said, shall he contendeth with the Almighty or instruct him? And reprove God and let him answer? Now look what Job says in chapter 40 and verse number 3. Job answered the Lord and said, look, Job made an admission right here. Behold, I am vile. What shall I answer thee? God, how can I give you an answer? You have shown me through this creative act here, these animal kingdoms, the way you control the lightning, the way you control the thunder, the way you control the rain, the hail, the snow, the frost, and such. He said, I am vile. What shall I answer thee? I will lay my hand upon my mouth. In other words, he said, I'm not going to say anything else. I'm going to be quiet. And a lot of times, that's the best thing to do in a situation. Sometimes is be quiet. I heard this old saying down through the years. When you talk, you say what you know. But when you listen, you learn what the other person knows. So Job says right here, I'm going to lay my hand upon my mouth. Verse number 5 of chapter 40, Job says, once have I spoken, yea, I will not answer. Yea, twice, but I will proceed no further. In other words, Job says, I'm just going to be quiet, God. I'm going to listen to what you say. So you see, Job here, Job's activity or Job's thoughts of maybe contending with or bringing an accusation against God has been totally deflated right here. He says, no, I'm not going to say anything else. And on over in chapter, chapter 42, I'm getting a little bit ahead too anyway. But he said, I have heard thee by the hearing of my ear, but now mine eye seeth thee. Wherefore I abhor myself, and I repent in dust and ashes. Job says, God, I realize I have nothing that I can say to you. I have nothing I can tell you because you already know everything. God is omnipotent. God is omniscient. He even knew the thoughts of Job's mind before Job ever said what he was going to say. So we see here that God has shown Job through these creative acts, through these acts of nature, through these animal kingdoms, through the control of the weather, through the control of the creation of this great universe, the fact that he set each planet in its perfect orbit, that he hung each star in its perfect orbit, that's items that you and I can't even comprehend. And yet Job here says, I'm not going to say anything else. I will proceed no farther. Okay, on down in verse number 40 right here, and verse number 6, then answered the Lord again, Job, out of the whirlwind, and said, gird up thy loins like a man. I will demand of thee and answer me. Will thou disannul my judgment? He said, Job, will you try to stand up against what I'm saying? Will you disannul my judgment? Will thou condemn me, that thou mayest be righteous? That's a pretty serious charge he's bringing to Job right here. He says in verse number 9, hast thou an arm like God? Or canst thou thunder with a voice like him? God is omnipotent. He has the power. He is in control. When he speaks, the universe has to just stop and listen. And a little finite mind like Job, he said, you need to stop just a moment, Job. You need to listen to me. And we're going to see that God is trying to get Job's attention here, and we're going to see as we end up the chapter here later on. But he said, my strength is in my arm. You know yourself, a person, when he mentions the strength of his arm here, that is God's power. That's God's strength. And he is in control. He's the strength of God can't be comprehended. You and I can't even fathom it. There's so many things in this world today that you and I can't even comprehend because of the power that God is showing here. So we see in verse, the arm of God, as I mentioned, I got a little slow right there. The arm of God mentions God's strength and his power. And the psalmist says in Psalms 89:13, thou hast a mighty arm, strong is thy hand, and high is thy right hand. So God is saying here to Job, his power is so much greater and so far above the comprehension of a man that there's just no way that we can even touch or think about this. And then we look on down into verse, and I wanted to get to this, but I don't know if we'll go ahead and look at verse 41. Chapter 41. He's speaking of here, he says, in verse number 41, he says, canst thou draw out the Leviathan with a hook, or his tongue, or a cord that thou lettest down? And he mentions here, some people think this is a hippopotamus, some people think this is a crocodile, because of the fact of the living in the water and the water circumstance that's mentioned here. But let's look on down to, let me get down here to this last verse. He's mentioned this animal here, the power that it shows, how man is afraid of this animal. Men who will bring this animal, try to catch this animal or try to kill it, it's almost beyond comprehension. They didn't have the modern weapons and the things that we have today. They had spears and swords and such. So he says, who can touch this animal? Who can even get around this animal? This animal is so powerful and so strong. When he raises himself up, the mighty are afraid. The sword of him that cannot touch him, the spear, nor the habergeon. He esteemeth iron as straw. The arrow cannot make him flee. Darts are counted as stubble. He maketh the deep to boil. You know, you saw on these nature movies, these crocodiles and such, out in these African rivers, they just seem like they just make the water just boil and churn whenever they're swimming through the water. So he says, then Job answered the Lord and said, I know that thou canst do everything, that no thought can be withholden from thee. Who is he that hideth counsel, therefore without knowledge? So Job says, God, I realize and know you are in control of this universe. You are the one who hung the stars out. You're the one who set the planets in their proper orbit. And he says, God, there's nothing I can say. There's nothing I can do. There's no reasoning from me that I can stand up to the great, mighty, powerful thoughts that you have. So we need to realize this as we go through life today. God is in control. And again, you've heard the question, I think Brother Rudy preached on it maybe last week or the week before, why bad things happen to good people. And as I mentioned in the beginning, we only see a small segment of time, but God sees the whole picture all the way through from the time you're born to the time you make that last trip. So we just need to place our complete faith and trust in God because He is in control. He is right, He's just, He's righteous, and He is always right in the decisions that He makes. Thank you very much.